Good afternoon all, welcome to Recovery and Future Generations PDC. Any apologies for absence, please?
No apologies from me, Chair.
I have Councillor Tyler Lloyd and Councillor Smith. Any disclosures of personal or prejudicial interests? No. So we move on to the minutes. As in the last meeting, which was 24th of November. Hang on, guys. Trying to open this is a nightmare. Right, okay, guys. So it's page 1, page 2, page 3. Any matters arising? Thank you. And then we move on to the agenda item co-production. I did speak to Lee Weenham, and he did say he would pop along. Obviously, it's he's new to the co-production, and obviously he's not here, is he? He did confirm with me that he would attend.
Hi, Irene. Do you know if Lee's coming at all?
I've just had a missed call on my mobile from him. Hang on, I'll just ring him now and see what's happening. Bear with me.
Cheers.
Thank you.
I think he's in.
Hiya, Cyril. Lee. Ah, he's just joining us. Lee.
Hi, Mandy. All right?
Yes, I'm okay.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
Good
Just took a
afternoon.
little while to
Welcome.
link in.
Thank you for your attendance. The arena's yours. We're on co-production.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
So I'll just give some background then. So Rian and I work on obviously the equalities agenda. Me as the head of service, the equalities or access to service team comes under me. Rian heads that small but very competent team. We have a strategic equality plan for the council, and those objectives were agreed by council, and members may remember there was a scrutiny inquiry into equality. So a lot of the actions from that inquiry fed into that equality plan, which is reviewed annually. We're also in the process of setting up a new strategic equalities and future generations board, and we've been working with councillors Gibbard and Pugh on that in particular. I think that stemmed from the poverty forum that's worked very well across the council, and I think members were keen to kind of replicate that for equalities and future generations issues. So we're just about setting that up, and that will bring together obviously the two issues of equalities and future generations, which cross over, and will help us then deliver those objectives. And I think another remit for that board is to help the council progress towards being a human rights city. So that'll be another matter for the board. Then on the issue of co-production, this issue came to my service area about a fortnight ago. So I'll tell you what's been done perhaps prior to me picking up as head of service. There was a co-production framework which was agreed for a corporate approach to kind of embedding co-production across the council. There hasn't been a huge amount of progress on that in the past months because I think of COVID, but also I wouldn't shy away from the issue of a lack of resource either. So although I can point to COVID and say that's been an issue, I think being more honest as well, we'd have to point to a lack of resource across the council to be able to do this, because the framework pointed to things like training and being able to train officers in the issue of co-production. So that needs to be tackled at some point. Having said that, social services, where perhaps co-production lends itself a little bit better than to other parts of the authority or to many other parts of the authority, they've drafted their own strategy, co-production strategy, which Rhian has looked at and I'll look at very soon. And they'll be hoping to roll that out. But I think as for across the council, really, I think at the minute, it's a difficult time to ask services to take on co-production work. But even when COVID hopefully settles down and passes us, I think we'll still have an issue with resource across the council. So that's something we will have to consider, because I think if we went to, say, any particular service now outside of social services and asked them to co-produce one of their policies or a strategy, I think they'd struggle because they haven't got the expertise or experience within their services to actually co-produce. So that's why I think the framework identified training. And there's not anyone in the council really that we can sort of give to a particular service at any one time to say, right, use a co-production expert, they're going to work with you for a couple of months or whatever. So we really do need to think about how we develop co-production across the council. And that's a brief overview there. Andy, I'm happy to take any questions or discuss wider matters with members. And if I can't help, I'm sure Rhian will be able to step in for me and offer a bit more expertise.
Right, the first question is from Councillor Hale. Do you want to come in, Joe?
Yeah, cheers, Lee. How are you doing?
Hi, Joe. I'm very good, thank you. Nice to hear you. You okay?
Yeah, not so bad.
Good.
Just pick up on your point that you feel that social services was a good area to steer co-production. Why is that? What's so different between social services and any other area of the council?
I think when the framework kind of spells it out, and I apologise to members if you haven't seen the council's agreed framework, which I'm just thumbing through now. But I think it's normally people-based services where co-production works better. I think that's what the framework, I'm just looking at the framework now, and it says co-production tends to be used most widely within people-based services such as social services, health and housing. And it's also a key requirement of the Social Services and Wellbeing Act. So it's those kind of, because it's like those people-based services where they can actually have an input into the way those services are being developed for them. I'm not saying that's the be-all and end-all, Joe. I think it's just normally accepted that it's in those kinds of services where there's a bit more leeway and latitude for people to actually really help shape services. I think a lot of our services are within a tight framework, so you can't really co-produce as such. But that isn't to say it's a closed door, and I'm not saying that. I just think that the kind of research and best practice tends to suggest it's those areas of housing, social services, kinds of services.
What I've seen, some national studies on co-production, especially from England, show that the real benefit to co-production, especially what councils are looking at, financial benefit, are to get volunteers and family members and other people involved in delivering social services. Yeah. There's a major report on that, and I think the chair might be well to try and source that. If I can find it again, I'll share it.
Yeah.
Thanks, Joe.
Cheers.
And I think it'd be interesting to see then what
Yeah.
the social services draft strategy looks like, to see whether you're taking that strategy and whether it encapsulates those points you've raised, Joe, about
Yeah, get
family,
your next
friends.
door neighbour to help. Get your next door neighbour to help.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, in all fairness, I think, COVID has forced us to do that as a council quite a bit. So during the first wave, we were seeing local area coordinators working with the local community to provide a lot of those services and just calling around to neighbours, making sure they're okay, that kind of thing. So it certainly happened out of necessity during COVID, but where the social services now want to continue taking that forward. And I think you've seen something similar with like parks. So, where we've tried to agree with the community to take on parks and bowling greens, that kind of thing. So I think there are pockets of it around the council. So I wouldn't want to mislead you and say it's only social services. I was just saying, that our framework is kind of pointing towards those areas a bit more.
Oh, I'm certainly all more for, or maybe local people taking more control of many aspects of council delivery, as long as they're given that support, because hopefully that will mean less of a top tier, won't it?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if we've got less people on the books, we need less people at the top.
Yeah.
Can I come in there, man?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Hang on. Sorry, Cyril. We got an order. Councillor Walton first, please.
Thanks, Mandy. Just a couple of practical things. I appreciate, Lee, you've only taken this on fairly recently. Yeah. Is it possible to bring a written update to our next meeting, the first meeting in January?
An update in terms of, I'm happy to do whatever the committee wants. It's just an update in terms of what?
Wherever you've got with co-production.
Okay.
I mean, I would certainly suggest 100%. Can we have a look at this framework anyway? Can that be circulated? Because I mean, it just gives a little bit more background as to what the council's doing. Because you've mentioned social services, you've also mentioned parks. I'm assuming with that you're alluding to friends of groups, things like that.
Yeah, I think that's kind of happened ahead of the co-production framework. So I think, if I'm being totally honest with you, having just inherited the co-production framework in the last couple of weeks, there hasn't been any progress as such in terms of rolling out across the council. And that, I think, when I spoke to Sarah Lackenby, formerly Colkin, about this, she did say that she had previously mentioned to the committee that resource was going to be an issue. And I don't know if members recall that discussion, but I don't think it's moved on from then. So there's been no resource identified in order to put together training, to roll out training, even as a starting point. But in all fairness to social services, they are progressing. I think because it's a requirement of the Social Services and Wellbeing Act, they are actually taking it forward. So I'm happy to obviously send you the framework. That will be a help for all members. But in terms of actual progress, I'd be lying if I said there's been much at all, really, because it has stalled because of resource, and with COVID, people just having really to do what's in front of them and get through this pandemic. So I don't think a written update on what's been achieved will be helpful, because it's very little, but I'll certainly send you the framework.
Okay, thank you.
Which includes a timeline of actions which have all been missed, but at least it sets out the actions, and obviously we need to put fresh timescales on them, because I think the actions are still appropriate. Do you agree, Rhian, that the actions within the framework are still appropriate? It's just obviously they've all been knocked back.
Yeah, no, the actions still stand. The timescales just have to be revisited, and possibly, I mean, now that the social services have got a draft strategy themselves, it may be worth re-looking at some of those actions as well, just to make sure that we are on the same page as social services and take some of the learning from them.
Thank you. Councillor Jones, please.
Excuse me. Yes, thank you, Chair. I struggle a little, I must confess, with the concept of co-production. I think I'm endeavouring to understand quite what it means, although I'm not convinced that I do actually understand how it's intended to be used. Some years ago, I was involved with the Welsh Government when they were, in fact, appointed a co-production senior officer to develop the concept and we had meetings spanning over about a year or so. And really, it didn't seem to me to come to anything much at all at the end of it. She was trying to develop quite what her understanding of the concept was. She didn't seem quite to grasp it. Consequently, I and others, I don't think, really grasped it. And it was rather unsatisfactory. That's not to say that we can't, of course, do it here in Swansea and understand it better. But I understand that it's a tricky concept. And one of the tricky aspects of it is, what do we mean by co-production as opposed to consultation, for example? I think we all understand that when the council is proposing a particular policy or step of measures or whatever it is, we endeavour to consult, sometimes well, sometimes badly, but at least we do endeavour to invite public input into whatever it is we're trying to do. So at what point does that public input become co-production? Is it simply that we listen to what others think about our proposal, and then we may or may not take account of it, and then go ahead with whatever it is we wanted to do anyway? Or are we actually, I think co-production, I presume, means asking members of the public to, in a sense, help us to develop a concept, help us to develop a strategy, so that it's an earlier stage than what I might call consultation. It's actually involvement. And I mean, I just think of the example we've had, and you may have picked up in the press recently, the problems we've had, for example, in Mayles Road over the development of a cycleway down there. Now, had there been co-production at an early stage in developing that concept, I suspect we would have avoided those difficulties and come up with something much better than the mess we seem to have ended up in, where we've got angry residents, confused and upset councillors, and a general situation of no one quite knowing what is the right thing to do. So that's an example of a failure of consultation, but it's also a failure of co-production. I don't want to ramble on too much because I am rambling, I realise that, but I'm trying to grasp the distinction and how, as a council in future, because we obviously haven't been doing it much in the past, not even with the voluntary groups in relation to parks with which I'm involved, just how are we going to ensure in future that we don't, before we consult, we co-produce? Because it seems to me that the one precedes the other. But I welcome your comments. Thank you.
For me, obviously, consultation is where you seek views from the public on proposals, maybe on a proposed scheme, on proposed changes, and then you take into account their views and you either act upon them or you don't. With co-production, I think in its truer sense, you're actually working as equal partners. So the council doesn't have the upper hand, so to speak. You actually work 50-50 with your stakeholders on producing whatever it is, a new service, a new policy, changes to something. So it's actually an equal footing. And that's a massive thing to do as an organisation, to, you know, actually go into something 50-50 and be genuinely open to co-producing and coming up with something that, you know, you agree on with your stakeholders. I can't guarantee that we'll always do that in the future, Councillor Jones, for lots of reasons. There'll be some issues where we don't want to co-produce, where we're actually governed by legislation quite specifically, and we may only just be consulting or informing. And I also come back to the resource issue. I don't want to, again, mislead members. I have to keep coming back to the resource issue. Sound like a stuck record and a negative person, but the reality of it is we're going to have to be really careful about the issues that we choose for co-production in the future for lots of reasons. We need to choose the right ones that lend themselves to co-production. They'll give us genuine, equal co-production, but also departments being able to do that and to do it properly. Because the worst thing would be to go out and say we're going to co-produce something and then make a hash of it. We really don't want to be doing that.
Co-production, it seems to me, can work where you can identify, say, an organised group in a community on something specific, like a cycle group, for example, to go back to my Mayles Road example of a few moments ago. In terms of wider involvement, I guess that has to be consultation. So I think it's a case of ensuring that with a project or a strategy proposal, you co-produce it with known groups who have a knowledge of and a direct interest in whatever it is and the possible outcome from whatever it is. And when you've co-produced, You then put the product out to the community more widely for comment in case you've missed something or the comment that the community needs to know, like Males Road again. So I guess that's the distinction. But you go back, you mentioned the issue of resource. Co-production could be really resource intensive to make it work on a proper scale, I guess. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Jones. Councillor Anderson?
Yeah, just going back to what Joe and Lee were saying, I can remember sitting on Child and Family Services where co-production come up, and Joe is quite right in what he is saying about engaging with partners and the actual person who you're trying to work with. And also, I agree with Lee. In these times of COVID, I think you would struggle to try and get a co-production through at this particular moment in time. And also with Councillor Jones, I think he's right in what he's saying. Perhaps if we can engage with people like what's happened down in the Males, engage with them first, perhaps may not have had this problem, but that's my take on it anyway.
Thank you, Cyril. Councillor Sherwood, please.
I think although Peter started off saying he didn't understand co-production, and then he went on to demonstrate that he understands it very well. And I think the Males Road example is a very useful and recent one. Yes, it would require a lot of resource to engage all the cyclists and residents and people that live nearby and make sure that that route gets planned and designed and delivered in a way that meets everybody's needs. But would that have saved, in the end, more resource than we are now using in firefighting as a result of not having had a proper conversation with people in the first place? Because Welsh Government actually thinks that that's true. Welsh Government thinks that we will be more efficient public service providers if we work this way. So they've been trying to get us to do this since, I don't know how long. I've only lived in Wales since 2005, and they had the Beecham Review. The Beecham Review of Public Services concluded that Wales has a very strong sense of public sector and a very poor sense of public service. We see ourselves as being here to deliver statutory functions, not really to engage with people and not really to serve them, but to do what our regulators expect us to do and to explain things away to people who don't like it. And the reason why social services is doing better at co-production is because the Social Services and Wellbeing Act has more teeth than the Wellbeing and Future Generations Act. You know, that they are the people who deliver social services are more responsive to their overriding legislation than we are to the Wellbeing and Future Generations Act, which is only Welsh Government's latest attempt to try and get us to actually engage with the people that we serve. There have been others. The whole of Communities First was trying to do it, but only with a very small group of people, those that are the most deprived. The creation of local service boards tried to do it again, but that was supposed to put the citizen at the centre. That was the big thing about the strategy called Making the Connections that created local service boards. But when it actually came down to the statutory teeth of it, we had to have a local service board. We didn't have to put the citizen at the centre. We had to have a local service board, and all the rationale for why we have a local service board and how they were supposed to work in order to put the citizen at the centre went out the window. And now we have public service boards, and we have the Wellbeing and Future Generations Act saying that we must practice involvement as one of the 5 ways of working. We must. And yet we still sit here and say, oh, but we can't, we haven't got the resources. Sorry. So how are we gonna get off the hamster wheel to be able to redesign the wheel in a way that we then benefit from the efficiency savings that co-production is actually supposed to bring us? You know, the problem is that we're looking at trying to implement co-production from a starting point that doesn't embrace it. So it's a bolt-on. It requires more resource than we have. And that's not what we're supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be realigning the resources that we do have and the strategies that we do work to and the practices that we do deliver in a way that incorporates co-production. So, you know, with respect, Chair, I think that is the gap that this Policy Development Committee needs to try and fill. You know, I don't think that a council which is as ingrained as this one is in the old ways of working that the government keeps telling us we have to change. I don't think we're going to just write a document and suddenly do things differently. I think it requires more of an overhaul than that, but probably bit by bit. Another reason why social services are able to do it better is that they already have a ready-made and captive audience. They've got a user group that you can literally lock in a room and force them to engage with you. But also because what you're doing affects them directly and they want to be involved. Now, I'm sure that an awful lot of people on the street would love to be involved in various things that we're doing, if only they knew. If only they knew what we were doing. We sit here in these rooms, well, virtually now, but there used to be wood-panelled rooms, you know, with big thick doors closed, talking about all kinds of things. And then a report comes out that's difficult for people to understand. You know, it's approved in a formal meeting that not many people can engage with. And that isn't how you co-produce things, and it isn't how you do citizen-centred services. So I think I would like to see the framework, and then I think we as a committee have got some work to do looking at how do we just embed co-production, and instead of it being a revolution, how do we just do it little by little? How do we do it incrementally? You know, and on the Policy Development Committee, which I chair, we're doing it just by having members of the public in the room. We're having members of the local co-production network who receive the papers and come and add their contributions and take them back and have a wider discussion. Again, not everybody knows about it, you know, and having someone from something called a co-production network is just really in danger of becoming another expert rather than the general public. And so we do need to be careful of that. But we might be able to come up with some recommendations for how the wider population is engaged more constructively in how we deliver things, as Peter was saying, before the consultation stage. How do you get to the point of knowing people are already happy with what you're trying to do before you start to do it, rather than just firefighting a load of mess afterwards? The Broadway junction that was remodelled between Uplands, Sketty and Cocket, I've never had so many complaints and so much upset and so many questions from people about something that in the end they liked very much. I've never, you know, it was such a drain of everybody's time responding to all these questions because there hadn't been the right kind of communication in the beginning about what was happening. And that all could have been prevented if, instead of saying, we've got X months to spend some money and here is a plan that we have which Welsh Government have approved, so here is an announcement and now move out of our way. If instead of doing that, we'd had a different conversation with people and explained more clearly and taken their advice on what would you like on our FAQ page? What would a plan look like to you that makes sense, rather than having engineers do it, because engineers are fantastic at engineering and they're not always very good at communication. And I think that there are massive efficiency gains to be made if we do this properly. So while I understand all the concerns about resource, I think we've got to find a creative way of doing this, because in the end it proposes to save resource for us.
Thank you, Mary.
Chair, I can't disagree with Councillor Sherwood. You know, I think it would be more efficient. I think the public do want involvement, and she's also quite right that just simply producing a framework isn't going to make it happen, as we have seen. I'm not sure when that framework was produced, but nothing has happened since it was produced. So, you know, I can't disagree with Councillor Sherwood. I think the good point she makes as well is that how do we stop the hamster wheel? Because we're carrying on as we are, and at some point we need to get ahead of it and say, right, we're going to do some co-production. what I would say is there's never a good time, but I think at the minute services are struggling so much. I'm speaking on their behalf, I know, but they are really under the cosh at the moment. And I think we have to be really careful about how we try to embed this and roll it out. I think we can, and I'm not saying we can't, but I think we just have to have one eye on the fact that there are a lot of services at the minute at breaking point, because they've had resources stretched from previous budgets anyway, but the last 9-10 months has just pushed them to places they never thought they'd be pushed. They really haven't. We could never plan.
And yet, if you don't mind me just popping back in, Chair, and yet, when that crisis struck, I've never seen this council do better co-production. Yeah. That is actually what we did.
Yeah.
Because we entered a space where suddenly nobody knew what was going on, and we were no longer the authority on people's lives. We actually opened our ears and said, "Oh my goodness, tell us what the hell is happening behind your front doors. Tell us what is going on in your lives, and tell us what we can do to help, and tell us what you can do to help as well." And that whole conversation actually initiated a load of work that is still bearing fruit. So sometimes crisis is actually when we go, do you know what, we can't handle this all on our own, and that's what's really valuable for co-production, is to take off that hat that says I'm in charge, I know what's best, and to start listening. And that is what we did when the pandemic struck, and it did work very well. So I think there are some lessons to be learned from that.
Yeah, thank you. Leslie, you're next on the list to contribute, but Rhian Miller. Rhian, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of say, I mean, I agree with everything that Mary's saying. I think some of the things that frighten people, I think some things that the committee could probably help with is the language. I mean, just having a conversation is a very easy thing to do. But when you say to people co-produce, they instantly just go, I don't know, they panic. So maybe it is those little simple steps that we were doing through the pandemic that we need to continue, and it's having those conversations with people at an early enough time so that they are fully aware of what's going on. And then yes, we can build that up, can't we, to co-produce in the end, but it's just having the conversation at the right time. I think that might be an important piece of work, that is to have that kind of breakdown of that kind of panic and fear, and just those little tiny steps, and which departments are doing in some cases, but they don't realise they're doing that, and it's having that across in a more consistent way across the piece. That's all I need to say.
Thank you, Rhian. Councillor Walton.
Yeah, two things just going on from what Rhian has just said, and also Mary alluded to it. Obviously, there has been progress on this then. Yeah. You've just said as much. Yeah. That's the kind of thing I want to know about. And that's the update I'd like to see. Now, again, I totally agree with Mary about Lee when he talks about resources. I have been stunned in being so impressed with what council staff have managed over the last few months. Beyond anything, I think you've all been absolutely fantastic. I can't think of anybody who I've dealt with who hasn't got back to me straight away, come back with something helpful. It's almost like none of you have been involved in this COVID because you've carried on. In fact, you've upped your game. So I can understand totally that you're probably almost at breaking point. So, I mean, I do understand that totally. What I think, ironically, and again, I would echo virtually everything Mary has said, I don't think this is going to take more resources. I think the end term is going to be less because it's going to be more effective. And not only that, it will stop this awful impression that the councils always give is that they know best, which a lot of the time is rubbish. They know best in certain areas. There's certain expertise that they've got, or they've got resources at their fingertips, or they've got money or whatever, but they don't know best. The person who knows best is the person who's on the receiving end. So the fact that we're even talking about co-production and we still haven't got there, in some ways I find absolutely incredible. We should have been doing this years ago. No, not years, decades ago, because that way we then use our resources as effectively as possible. We get the people to be involved in what affects them so that they are then satisfied. We then get less complaints. I mean, can you see the virtuous circle that I'm producing here? So much better than the fact that inevitably, because we haven't got co-production working yet, things like some of the projects people have mentioned have gone wrong because we haven't been able to do that step, or we haven't been ready to do that step. So instead, we resort to consultation, which, yes, we've got to do it, but I get very suspicious as to how good consultation is. One, I think, again, it comes back to the fact I don't think it necessarily reaches everybody, because the number of times when I know the council have done it and a week or two later you hear somebody saying we weren't consulted. So you'd avoid all of that because you'd have them involved right from the outset. Anyway, I think I've exhausted myself. Thank you,
Leslie.
Just
right,
a few points on that, Mandy. Sorry, Councillor Walton, what I meant was, when I said there hadn't been progress, I meant against the action plan set out in the framework. There's about 7 milestones, I think, just reading now. They've not been taken forward. As for on the ground, I'm sure there are a lot of examples of co-production going on. And I also think as well, you as members have a huge role to play. Yeah. Quite often, you're dealt a fait accompli in terms of policies, things that are going to cabinet, things that are happening in your wards. You should be saying to officers, hang on, I don't like this fait accompli. Let's go back a few steps. And as members, you'll know, you'll have like a forward look diary, so you'll see what's coming through in terms of decision making for members. And again, you've got that role where you can say, actually, I think we should have a different approach to developing this policy, or the changes that are happening in Wine Street. Let's actually go back a step and let's co-produce what's going to happen in Wine Street. So, you know, again, don't be afraid as either ward members of this committee, or seeing things which are going forward through to cabinet, to speak up and kind of not demand, but, you know, put forward the co-production agenda to make sure that what's coming through the decision-making system has gone through the right channels you'd want them to.
Councillor Haley, you're the last one to contribute on this besides me. Joe?
Yeah, only just what I've heard about co-production. It's clear I'm not against co-production. During the first wave of the pandemic, our Unison branch in Swansea Health branch, worked with humanitarian aid. We worked with various other organisations delivering food to staff within the hospitals that weren't getting a break. We've seen co-production in St Thomas and all the other wards with delivering school meals. But the one thing that stands out for me during all that period, and we also delivered and supplied PPE with partner organisations. But the one thing that stood out, it wasn't sustainable. It was clearly everything was done under stress. So for everybody that's shouting co-production is great, you want to see some of the people that we were dealing with daily, weekly, monthly, where co-production was putting them at a great strain. And in essence, these are all volunteers. I'm a volunteer for my union club, you know, so we were seeing the creep in the system. And just one thing on consultation, I mean, Lee knows very well that consultation has to be genuine. And it's not about whether the authority sees fit to say yes or no to responses that come to them from a consultation. It's whether they act on those responses. And there's really good case law on that as well. So, thanks very much. Cheers, Mandy.
On that issue, you know, Rhian can talk a lot longer and more detail than I can on consultation, but obviously we adopt the gun-in principles. So, you know, we do ensure, or we try to ensure, that our consultation is effective, that, you know, when we go out to consultation, we listen to the feedback. But then it comes back to the council to decide how to deal with that feedback in terms of what they take on board, how much of it, how they deal with the ideas that have come forward, the opposition or the support for the proposals. And, you know, no doubt we'll be doing that now with the budget you know, at some point we'll go out on consultation for the budget. We do that every year. And then it's a matter for the Cabinet then to decide how to reconsider those proposals based on what the public have come back and told them. So yeah, I don't know if there's anything you want to add, Rhian, about our approach to consultation.
No, I mean, in terms of anything sort of really hard-hitting and strategic, absolutely, the gunning principles are key. Case law that Councillor Hale mentioned, the gunning principles form part of that. I suppose it's those not things that fall through the cracks. You know, the Broadway example that Mary spoke about, there probably are little examples where we haven't quite got it right and where departments are maybe constrained by either the financial pressure they're under, or even by the grant, boundaries, etc. That means that they actually can't have that kind of open engagement around what they want to do. I don't know the details, sorry, about that particular scheme, but there are definite examples where we are constrained in terms of what we can and can't consult on, because as you said, it has to be genuine, that consultation. So if we can't change something, or we can't bend, then we shouldn't be asking that question. So it is true. I think we do need to have a bit more of a look across the piece. But in our more strategy rigorous consultations are always done quite well, and do meet the legal requirements that they need to.
I did say, Mary, nobody else, but come on, last one, make it quick.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. I was just going to say that co-production really starts with an attitude. And so if you want to use the Broadway example, I think is a good one, because yes, they were constrained by funding and by what had already been approved by Welsh Government years ago, because that's what Welsh Government do. They say, give us some schemes that you've already got on the shelf and we'll approve them quickly, and there isn't time to do co-production. And then in that case, if you have it in your mind that how the community reacts to what you're doing matters to you, and that you want them to be fully aware of what you're up to and to have the opportunity to influence whatever they can influence, then you open yourself up to that. And the co-production consists of a conversation where you say, this is what is definitely happening and what can't be changed. So with that in mind, what should we talk about? Because I had people asking, can there be more bushes? Can there be more planting? Does this street lamp have to go right outside my window? Well, it's there now, so I guess yes. But maybe if there'd been a conversation earlier on, they could have rearranged things so that it wasn't right outside her window. So there's an idea that things are fixed and are as they are, and we just don't want to hear from people because we can't do anything about it. But actually, if we opened ourselves up to the conversation, we might be surprised to find that what they want is something that we can do. Yeah. And that, and actually it might be about where we place the signage and particular days or times that the diversions could be rearranged, things that they know about because they live there and we don't. You've got to start by being open to what people tell you and not always expecting hostility. And I think that's what we do a lot of the time.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mandy. I appreciate that.
I would just like to say, Lee and to Rhian, obviously post and pre-COVID, we should be learning a lot, because I agree with everyone on this committee. We've done really well, and we have. And, the balance of probably failure, where this was thrown upon us, where we were not prepared, nobody was expecting us to be in this position. We have done really well, and that's from the top down and from the bottom up. And, as ward members, we are very aware, of what the passions are and the negativities in the wards. And when we go back to cycle tracks, I understand that when we are given a pot of money, it has to be utilised, it has to be, spent. And in the case of the Trathlon bypass, Councillor Lloyd and myself we were hammered. And it wasn't even our bypass, it was the Trathlon bypass, but we took all the destruction. And that's all they had to do was to speak to the residents and probably speak to us as ward members as well, because we are a link here. And when we talk about consultation, I think that's the biggest disappointment I have. I've been around 8 years here now, and I still feel maybe we are not consulted, or maybe just a little two-liner to say, actually, in Bonamine Ward, A, B, C, D, because we know the passions and the negativities. And in this case of the cycle track, they had built, well, kind of compiled and constructed this cycle track. There was already a cycle route there, and they diverted from that and caused, well, major upset, and we still have an upset. And it wasn't a cycle track, it was like a road, because we had 4-wheel vehicles entering and accessing and exiting. It was a nightmare. So when we talk about consultation and co-production, you know, we are probably the major link in this, because we know our wards, and we know the tipping point in the wards. And, you know, it's not only in the wards, it's about what we know, what we know about the city as well, about the residents' desires. It is important. So, you know, it should be as basic as possible, but we should learn from how well, you know, we have done, and how well our staff have done over this last, well, what is it, 9-month period now? You know, and maybe the learning curve should be that we should take some of these fine examples where we have achieved so much and, you know, encompass them into strategy and policy, because we have done really well. And I don't want to be sitting around a table in 2 years' time saying, well, actually, we done so well in July 2020. Why are we discussing this again? And maybe it is where the resources are going to come from, because it's a lesson learned. We have done well. But then if we have failed, we need to look at that as well. And, you know, co-production is about taking all the partners along, because probably there's a lot we are missing, which would kind of contribute to a lot of resource. So, yeah, I think we should have the framework, and we should, you know, really explore as to where we go with it, to be honest. Thank you.
Okay, so as a starting point, if I send the framework through to yourself, Mandy, and then the rest of the committee, I'll do it via Kate. Is that okay, Kate? If I send you the framework, send it on to members, and then you can see just the key principles of what the framework says and the milestones which haven't really been taken forward. And then, yeah, happy to revisit that whichever way the members see fit. And yeah, let's work together and see where we can go.
Thank you.
No problem. Thank you for having us.
Thank you. You're more than welcome. Don't worry, you'll have an invite again.
I know I will. Thank you. Look forward to it.
Have a Merry Christmas, all.
Yeah, Merry Christmas. Bye.
Bye.
Next agenda item is natural environment. Peter, I'm going to ask how your meeting went yesterday, because I was hoping to attend, but things were kind of prioritised in a different way. So do you want to open this agenda item and give us a basic
I thought you might ask me,
outline?
Matt. I don't quite know why, but there we are. But thank you for doing so anyway. First of all, just on the meeting yesterday, our meeting, Mandy, never took place. And this, in fact, we held the pre-meeting on Friday afternoon. This is the Natural Environment Performance Panel, for those who don't know. But Rob got in touch with me on Wednesday afternoon, expressing serious concern that our meeting yesterday was going to take up the time of 4 cabinet members to cover the field that the natural environment, biodiversity and climate change would require their presence. And he was concerned that that was going to take them away from COVID responsibilities. So I arranged with Bridge that we would cancel yesterday's meeting and that we would expand the meeting that in any case we were going to have on Friday afternoon, but without officers. And simply amongst ourselves, we formed ourselves as a working group, a model that I think Mary has established very well and I'm copying. And we had a very good meeting. But I'll come back to that if necessary later. In terms of this committee's responsibility as a PDC, of course, PDCs are responsible, teaching a mother how to suck eggs, to identify areas of policy to be developed. It's what we say, what it says on the tin. But up until now, there really hasn't been there hasn't been a PDC with a responsibility for carrying forward policy on the environment. And this has been a concern for me for at least the last 2 years, and ever since the Scrutiny Natural Environment Inquiry, which I chaired. I had really wanted that to recommend the creation of a PDC, but for some reason we didn't at the end of the day. That was probably a mistake on our part. And where the running has taken place, of course, on natural environment thinking and policy, has been in scrutiny. And that incidentally has created an interesting sort of example of the grey area, in my view, that exists between scrutiny and policy development. Because of course in scrutiny, yes, we're looking at what a council has been doing, and then in the light of what it has been doing, suggesting perhaps what it should be doing, where we're not satisfied with what has happened in the past. And that's not really very different from what a policy development committee does, which is to look at an area of policy and decide how to move an area forward, perhaps in ways that we haven't done in the past. But that's another story. I don't want to get into a debate now about scrutiny and policy development committees. But I think there is a serious issue there. But scrutiny, of course, has worked. We worked in the light of the Wellbeing Act of 2015, in particular the Resilient Wales Duty Wellbeing goal to maintain and enhance biodiversity, and similarly Section 6 of the Welsh Government's 2016 Act, which expands on the Resilient Wales concept and responsibility of local authorities. And we, of course, are now required to report on an annual basis to Welsh Government in terms of how we're moving forward on biodiversity responsibilities. We had the Natural Environment Scrutiny Inquiry back in 2018 and into 2019. That inquiry produced 20 recommendations, 18 of which were approved either in whole or in part, and 2 were rejected, which I'll come back to in a moment because they're quite serious and shouldn't be lost sight of. And of course, we've now got the corporate priority and the corporate plan for natural resources and biodiversity, which again, I think was a spin-off of the Natural Environment Inquiry, and I think a very successful and important spin-off from that inquiry, because hitherto the corporate plan, although it had odd references through it to biodiversity, there was no specific corporate well-being objective, and that was a serious mistake, certainly in the context of what is happening globally and in the light of Welsh Government legislation and responsibilities. We've also now, of course, there is a corporate biodiversity and climate change action group of senior officers, and the Natural Environment Scrutiny Panel, which has now been created and which I chair. That panel will receive reports from the Wellbeing Objective Officers Group, because hitherto we've heard nothing about what this corporate biodiversity group has actually been doing. Even from talking to officers in nature conservation, they didn't seem to know what it's been doing or whether it's been doing anything at all. And this is one of the problems with the natural environment. I think we've certainly, maybe I'm being paranoid, but I've always taken the view that we're struggling as the environment sector to get our voices understood, heard, and then delivered in terms of actions, which of course a PDC should be able to help us with. But we've now got a corporate biodiversity action plan in preparation. We've got a green infrastructure strategy, of course, developed. We're developing a council tree policy. Nature conservation people are carrying out a biodiversity audit across different areas of the council. As a council, of course, we passed a climate emergency motion back in June of last year, and the climate emergency interacts with the biodiversity emergency, as I would call it. And indeed, this Friday, we're going to be signing our climate charter, which is an important statement of commitment on our part as a council. During COVID, we've seen the benefit of people walking and cycling more, which has implications for the natural environment and enjoying the natural environment in terms of making more use of our parks and gardens and so forth. We've seen grassed areas on roadside verges being left uncut, which has produced more wildflower coverage, which again I think has been a benefit that people have seen. So I think the importance of the natural environment has grown in terms of people's awareness and understanding. This council has a good story to tell, I think it's fair to say. Obviously there's more to be done, but nevertheless there is a good story to be told. There are issues to be addressed. One of major concern to me is our continuing use of glyphosate, which as a herbicide, which has nasty consequences for insects, particularly honeybees and others. And that's something that we should be looking at as a scrutiny group early in the new year. But I think there is a growing awareness. I mean, I would like to pay tribute, if I may, Chair, to the nature conservation team of this council, and particularly to Deb Hill, the team leader. They work under enormous pressures, financial, and yet they're doing an amazing job in terms of, excuse me, trying to do as much as they can in terms of improving the natural environment across Swansea. And they really are impressive. Which brings me to the two final points, if I may, well, the final point in particular, the two recommendations that were not accepted from my Natural Environment Inquiry panel were two new posts. One, what we call a Section 6 officer, to take responsibility for acting on and delivering the Section 6 responsibility under the Environment Act to maintain and enhance biodiversity and to maintain healthy ecosystems. The nature conservation team are doing their best on that, but they really need a dedicated officer to do it. That was included in the budget, but no doubt for reasons to do with COVID and financial problems at the moment, that post hasn't been financed and certainly hasn't been filled. And then also for a part-time planning ecologist, which is certainly needed, because part of the problem, of course, in terms of environmental management and ecological sustainability is to ensure that planning commitments made in relation to development are actually adhered to as far as ecological constraints and requirements are concerned. And that again requires a dedicated member of staff actually to do. So those two concerns remain on the agenda. My panel will continue to pursue it, and I shall be obviously talking to relevant officers in relation to that to try and reopen these, or rather release these posts to be filled. But anything that this committee is able to do to endorse that, I would certainly welcome. I'll pause there, Chair, but basically to make the point that I asked Natural Environment to be included as part of this committee's responsibilities for the simple reason that, quite frankly, it ain't the responsibility of anybody else at the moment, other than through the scrutiny process. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Any contributions? So obviously, oh, I got an echo now, haven't I? Let's try again. So Peter, you brought this to obviously because of the two posts that need to be filled, yeah, and because obviously it's not on any other agenda, not on any other committee at all.
Yeah, especially the latter of those, Mandy. I mean, we now have this wellbeing objective incorporated into the council's corporate plan. It runs to several pages. It's very good, lots of detail, lots of commitment, lots of tasks in hand to make it possible. And yet there's no publicly accountable body, such as a PDC, responsible for doing it. And we have this officers working group, which I have to say hasn't reported anywhere. And because of the cancellation of yesterday's meeting, where it was due to report, hasn't done so. And that's not satisfactory at all. And we really must open up what the council's thinking and actions are in relation to environment, and hence coming back to this committee. But also, of course, just to make the point that those two posts really are needed. It isn't special pleading, they are needed. As far as the Section 6 post in particular, that's effectively a legislative requirement under the Environment Act. Because if we don't deliver on Section 6, we'll be in trouble with the Welsh Government. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Councillor Hale, do you want to come in, please?
Cheers, Mandy. Yeah, just like to support Peter in his endeavours. I think he knows one or two of the environmentalist lobby that I've got over in St Thomas. And it's clear that the planning department spend very little time looking at our environment and looking at the ecological damage that development is doing and has done. And we apart from Kilvey Hill, we continue to lose green space in St Thomas, and it's something that's just not sustainable. So wholeheartedly support Peter in his endeavours. And I'd like to support that proposal particularly. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Joe. Councillor Sherwood.
Thanks. I was just wondering, I mean, presumably the scrutiny performance panel is going to be monitoring progress on the actions that were agreed in the scrutiny inquiry. So I suppose I'm wondering what then can this committee do to complement that? I wonder if Peter has any specific actions in mind that would benefit from, you know, more intensive sort of policy development, which would then feed into the scrutiny performance panel as progress on the actions agreed arising from the scrutiny inquiry.
Chair, if I could just come back quickly on Mary's very sensible and reasonable
yes,
point.
you may, Peter.
It goes back to what I was saying early on in my remarks. What is the distinction between a PDC and a scrutiny performance panel? Because basically what we've been doing in scrutiny has been very much policy development, but we've been doing it under the guise of scrutiny. If there were to be a PDC with a direct responsibility, as perhaps this committee will now take on, we shall have to obviously be doing much of what the scrutiny performance panel is already doing in terms of monitoring delivery. I mean, the thing is, the council's already got this wellbeing objective, and it's got a series of a dozen or so steps listed there of actions that need to be taken. Some of those are already being taken, others are yet to be taken, and obviously scrutiny can monitor how well or badly those actions are being taken. Whether there's a role in what we need to ask ourselves, and I don't pretend at this moment to have the answer to Mary's question, is are there further actions that we feel should be taken by the council through this committee, presumably, that currently are not present in the wellbeing objective within the corporate plan? And that's something we can think of. And if members want to, I can go away and come back at a future meeting with proposals, because I'm sure there are. But as I say, up to now, the whole approach under the natural environment heading in this council has been through the scrutiny process. And although I think we've been incredibly successful in what we've achieved, the inquiry panel, the wellbeing objective, and so on and so forth, I'm sure there are things that we could be doing that aren't present in that particular plan. But I apologise, I can't at this moment, off the back of an envelope, come up with a list of things. But I'm quite happy to go away and think about what we could be doing. And incidentally, and thank you to Joe Hale for his remarks. I'm very grateful, Joe. Thank you.
Mary, do you want to?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think that in the interests of being clear that the work of scrutiny is different to the work of policy development, it would perhaps be good to pull out some recommendations from the scrutiny inquiry that would benefit from, you know, concerted policy development, which perhaps could, you know, be the remit of this committee. And one suggestion, if I may, Chair, is just that actually the LDP has changed a lot. You know, the new LDP that was drawn up in response to Planning Policy Wales 2018, which revised Planning Policy Wales in light of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, does insert a lot more protection for the natural environment and a lot more obligation on developers to enhance the natural environment and install green infrastructure as they go along and create developments. But these are things which people are not really very well aware of. I think the planning department obviously has a good understanding of them. Some councillors and other officers in other departments have some understanding of them, but the general public doesn't really. And especially when I'm talking with really seasoned environmental campaigners, they want to talk about the decades and decades of neglect, and it's hard to say, yes, but actually the new LDP is going to take care of all of that. And then they think I'm being very naive, but I think maybe they're just ill-informed. I think it would be really, really great to have a very simple kind of idiot's guide to how our current LDP will protect and enhance the environment, and how people who've been concerned for a long time about the planning regime can perhaps be somewhat reassured now. And I think that if we could produce something like that, if we could get some help from the relevant officers to produce something like that, I think that would be a really good output from this committee. It's not policy development, but in the interest of working more closely with the public, you know, along the lines of our previous discussion about co-production, I think producing a resource which communicates more effectively how our policies have already changed in order to protect the environment could be a positive piece of work for this committee to do.
Thank you, Mary. Peter, do you want to come back in there?
Yes, very quickly. First of all, Mary's suggestion is absolutely right and welcome, and I shall go away and work in relation to that, because she's absolutely right. I just wanted to add, when I came onto this council 3.5 years ago, I came on as an enthusiastic environmentalist. I'm still an enthusiastic environmentalist, by the way, but I came on and I felt that the council really wasn't on board to the environmental agenda at all, or not very much. It had just begun to take notice of the Wellbeing Act. It certainly hadn't yet picked up in its thinking the Environment Act. I think 3.5 years on, a lot of progress has been made in terms of the culture, at least, or the thinking and what words get put onto paper, and even that gets said in meetings. But it still remains an issue to ensure that those nice words and that increasing, I hope, understanding are actually translated into practice, into policy. And as Mary has said, it's really the LDP that is the vehicle. And we've got to look to ensure that, in particular, that our planning department and the members who relate to that understand the issue and give ecology the importance that it deserves, alongside selling off a site for a lot of money and the development benefits in terms of housing and so on. I know there's a balance to be struck, but that balance needs to take proper account of environment, take proper account of biodiversity. We've all seen the global collapse in biodiversity. We're all seeing the global rise in carbon emissions. I don't have to repeat all that. One of the things is that in those 3.5 years, I think members and officers have got on board to the realization that the biodiversity emergency and the climate emergency are real, are serious, they're happening now. It's not something in the future, it's happening even as I speak. And we just got to ensure that as a policy development committee, we identify those areas where we can be pushing rather than reacting to the actions of members and officers elsewhere. So I take the points that have been made. I'll go away and think about them, and thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Councillor Walton, let's contribute.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Couple of points. One, I'm assuming that as we're having this conversation and it is an item on this agenda, can I assume that this is going to carry on as part of the remit of this committee? That's point number one. Point number two, we've referred to planning, and I think it's a little bit unfair to make comments about planning when there's nobody here, neither an officer or anybody on the planning committee. And maybe it'd be worth considering, if we're going to look at things like planning as part of natural environment, we should be inviting an officer to a future meeting so we can actually ask them what's the current situation. It's a bit unfair to make comments when there's nobody here to come back. And I'm not on planning anymore, so I have no idea of the detail at the moment, because I've not been on planning for quite some years. Thank you.
Cyril, you're the last contribution.
Yeah, can I just, I apologise, I had to leave the meeting for a minute, but can I just remind Peter, I don't know if he knows, that my PDC has changed now from economy, environment and infrastructure. Would this be crossing over between two PDCs?
Can I come in there, guys?
If I may. I am on Cyril's committee, and indeed I see that the agenda, Cyril, on Thursday afternoon will be looking at green infrastructure. So I'm a bit confused as well as to quite now who is taking the lead responsibility, and I'd welcome guidance. You're absolutely right.
Sorry, Peter. I think my take on this is obviously maybe it should sit with Cyril, as it is the environment. We brought it here today to have a conversation, to open it up, to have a feel generally of where we are and maybe where it should sit. I think my take is definitely should be with Cyril, as it is environment. And and obviously we are on, you know, the recovery and future generations. There is a bit of a crossover there, but I believe it should be with Cyril's PDC, as it is environment.
I'm happy with that ruling, yes, thank you.
Are we all in agreement? Yeah, okay. Right then, thank you, Peter, very much. I've learned a lot today again off you. Very interesting. So the only thing left on the agenda is the work plan. We've got one item, maybe we should add, we got energy for 26th of January. I suggest we add co-production back on, because we will have the framework. We've got time then to obviously digest it and bring any proposals back or any suggestions back. I have emailed Councillor Lewis and Councillor Hopkins, and I am going to get in touch with Councillor Gibbard, obviously for them to have input into the PDC and for them to bring obviously their agenda items forward. Joe, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I was just going to say, man, did you would you like me to contact Adam Hill to suggest whether the committee wants to look at anything in relation to the recovery plan?
Yes,
so, you know,
please.
he's done the recovery plan, and we looked at the workforce last time, but it might be you know, heads up of policies and development that the committee can contribute to at an early stage.
Yes, please.
Okay.
Mandy, can I reiterate that can we please have a written co-production report? I don't even care if it's only 2 sentences long, but I'm sick and tired of coming to meetings and the reports are verbal. Now, I'm sorry, I'm trying not to be too annoyed about it, but this happens too often, and for various reasons I don't think it's right. We should have something that we've looked at, so that when we come to the meeting we've got something to go on, as well as hearing what else the officer says. So as I say, I'm not expecting anything huge. I just want something to give me a bit more meat on the bones before we come to the actual meeting. Thank you.
I will relay that to Lee Winham. I'll speak to him and tell him that obviously, you know, during the conversation with Lee, you know, we did ask last month, but I know he's new to the game, but as you say, it can be as basic or as fulfilling as possible. It's just a report. So I will write to him and ask him for a written report along with the framework as an attachment.
Thanks,
Joe,
Mandy.
Joe, do you want to come in?
Yeah, just to support what Leslie just said. I mean, I'm very mindful of it in my workplace. If we have joint meetings and we don't get reports, we often view that with a huge degree of cynicism that they're trying to stick things through. So, so a report is always so useful for reference, and it's also a means of pinpointing questions that you need answered. So, yeah, definitely. It could happen. It could just happen.
Thank you, Joe. So for January 26th, then we'll have energy and co-production. I'll write to Lee, obviously, you know, for the report and the framework. I'll invite him back as well. And Adam Hill then, okay, on the recovery. Thanks, Joe. Okay then. Have a lovely Christmas all. Look after yourself, keep safe. I'm not going to say what my Christmas is going to be like, because I can't swear because I'm public, but still. But they have actually finished. Well, they haven't finished my house because they still got my drive to do, but I'm still in a mess. No Christmas tree, nothing. But I'm going to have a Merry Christmas and we'll go open a big bottle of gin, guys. So I'll see you all in 2021. Look after yourself and just keep very, very safe. And remember that COVID is still very much amongst us, guys. So keep safe.
Thanks, Mandy.